The night was heavy, pregnant with an eerie silence that felt almost unnatural. A low fog hung in the air, clinging to the trees like ghostly apparitions. In the heart of this unsettling stillness, nestled amidst a sprawling estate, stood the imposing residence of Colonel Ralph Wald. The colonel, a man forged in the fires of war, was used to facing danger head-on. Yet, on this night, something sinister stirred in the darkness, something that would test even his mettle. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its resonant tones swallowed by the thick silence that permeated the house. The colonel lay asleep, his wife Eleanor beside him, her breathing slow and rhythmic. A floorboard creaked in the distance, a subtle sound that nevertheless pierced the quiet, rousing the colonel from his slumber. He lay still, listening intently, his heart pounding against his ribs. He slowly rose from the bed, careful not to wake Eleanor. He reached for the antique saber that hung above the fireplace, a relic from his time in service, its polished steel glinting faintly in the darkness. He moved soundlessly toward the bedroom door, his hand gripping the saber's hilt, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew with chilling certainty that something was terribly wrong. Each step was a descent into the unknown, a journey into the heart of a mystery that would unravel with terrifying consequences. He reached the top of the grand staircase, its polished mahogany banister cold beneath his hand. From his vantage point he could see the faint outline of the front door, its stained glass panels casting an array of distorted colors on the floor below. His gaze swept across the living room, his eyes struggling to penetrate the shadows that clung to the corners. It was then that he saw it, a flicker of movement, a fleeting shadow that danced near the fireplace. His pulse quickened, adrenaline surging through his veins. He crept down the stairs, each step measured, controlled. The saber felt reassuringly heavy in his hand, a familiar weight that grounded him in the face of fear. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he heard a muffled thud, followed by the distinct sound of glass shattering. He moved swiftly toward the sound, his senses on high alert, his mind conjuring images of masked intruders and violent confrontations. The intruder stood near the shattered window, his back to the colonel, a dark silhouette against the pale moonlight. The colonel raised the saber, its polished surface reflecting his grim visage, his voice a low growl, hardened by years of command. "Don't move! I have a weapon!" he boomed, his voice echoing in the silence. The intruder lunged towards him, a glint of metal flashing in the darkness. The colonel instinctively parried, the clash of steel ringing through the air. The colonel, despite his age and the searing pain in his arm, was no stranger to hand-to-hand combat. Years of military training kicked in, his body reacting with an instinctive grace honed over countless battles. He deflected another blow, the sound of metal against metal echoing through the house. He pressed his attack, forcing the intruder back towards the shattered window, the source of the cold night air that now swirled around them. With a surge of adrenaline, the colonel managed to disarm his attacker. The weapon, a heavy silver candlestick, clattered harmlessly to the floor. The intruder stumbled back, her face illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the broken window. The colonel's blood ran cold. It was not a hardened criminal staring back at him, but a young woman, her eyes wide with terror, her body trembling. "Who are you?" the colonel demanded, his voice hoarse with shock and exertion, his grip tightening on the saber. The girl cowered before him, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "Please," she whimpered, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't hurt me, I didn't mean to, I had to get away." The colonel lowered the saber slightly, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of this terrified girl with the violence of the attack. He saw not a hardened criminal, but a victim, someone who had been through a harrowing ordeal. The colonel, his arm throbbing from the wound, ordered the girl to stay put while he contacted the authorities. She sat huddled on the floor, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, her eyes fixed on the shattered window, as if it held the answer to her nightmares. The colonel watched her for a moment, his mind awhirl with questions. He couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. Her terror seemed genuine, but what was she running from? And why choose his house, a house set back from the road, shrouded in darkness? The local sheriff, a portly man named Howard, arrived within minutes, his face flushed, his brow furrowed with concern. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, taking in the shattered window, the overturned furniture, the colonel clutching his bleeding arm, and the young woman huddled on the floor. "All right, Colonel, what do we have here?" Sheriff Howard asked, his voice gruff but laced with a hint of concern. The colonel recounted the events as they unfolded, his voice clipped and precise, his military training evident in his concise narrative. He described the intruder, the struggle, the shock of discovering the intruder was a young woman. Sheriff Howard listened intently, his eyes narrowing as the colonel spoke, his fingers drumming a steady tattoo on his notepad. He occasionally glanced at the girl, who remained huddled on the floor, her body rocking slightly, her eyes downcast. As the colonel finished his account, Sheriff Howard let out a low whistle. "Well, Colonel," he said, scratching his chin thoughtfully, "seems like you had yourself quite a night." The colonel nodded curtly, his gaze fixed on the girl. The girl's story tumbled out in a torrent of tears and half-whispered words, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own sobs. She spoke of a life of hardship, of running away from a past that haunted her, of seeking refuge in the first place that seemed safe. She claimed she had been hiding in the woods behind the colonel's property for days, her fear growing with each passing hour. When she could bear the hunger and the cold no longer, she had seen the light in the colonel's window, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Sheriff Howard listened patiently, his face a mask of professional detachment, but the colonel thought he detected a flicker of sympathy in the lawman's eyes. He watched as the sheriff gently coaxed more details from the girl, his voice calm and reassuring, his demeanor disarming. She spoke of a nameless threat, of shadowy figures and whispered threats, her words fragmented, disjointed, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting a terrifying reality. The investigation continued throughout the night. Forensics dusted for fingerprints, their movements precise and methodical as they searched for any clue that might corroborate the girl's story. The colonel watched them work, his arm bandaged, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than met the eye. The girl's story, while harrowing, lacked a certain ring of truth. Her details were vague, her explanations evasive. He had faced countless interrogations during his time in the military, and he recognized the signs of someone holding back, of someone carefully constructing a narrative. Days turned into weeks, and the unsettling events at the colonel's residence became a topic of much speculation in the small, quiet town. The colonel, once a pillar of the community, found himself at the center of a mystery that seemed to deepen with each passing day. The girl, whose name it turned out was Mary, became an object of both pity and suspicion. Others whispered about her evasive answers, her inconsistent story, her eyes that seemed to hold secrets. He visited Mary at the shelter, his demeanor kind but his eyes sharp and observant. He listened as she recounted her story, her voice soft and hesitant, her eyes downcast. He noticed the way her eyes darted nervously around the room, her gaze avoiding his. He left the shelter, more convinced than ever that Mary was hiding something, that her story was a carefully constructed facade. The colonel, a man of action, decided to take matters into his own hands. He began by researching Mary's past, following the faint trail of her life through public records and newspaper clippings. He discovered that Mary was not an orphan, but a runaway from a wealthy family. Her parents were a loving couple, desperate to find their missing daughter. They had spared no expense in their search, their faces on missing person posters. Mary had a history of running away, fabricating stories and manipulating those around her. She was a master manipulator, a skilled actress who could turn her tears on and off. He realized she had used her vulnerability to weave a web of deceit. He felt a surge of anger at himself for being taken in by her charade. He contacted Sheriff Howard, sharing his findings. The sheriff, initially skeptical, listened intently as the colonel laid out his case. He produced the newspaper clippings and public records. The sheriff agreed to reopen the investigation, respecting the colonel's tenacity. The investigation took a dramatic turn. As Mary's lies unraveled, a disturbing truth emerged. Her motive was not just money or attention. She targeted the colonel's house for a chilling reason. She followed the colonel for weeks, drawn by his wealth. Rumors of a valuable antique collection fueled her plan. She staged a break-in to steal, underestimating the colonel. His resilience and military training foiled her plan. Her plan backfired, leaving her facing serious charges. She traded privilege for a cold cell and community scorn. The colonel felt relief, but also deep betrayal. He had risked everything to protect her, only to be deceived. The betrayal left scars deeper than any physical wound. The case of the Midnight Mystery, as it came to be known, sent shockwaves through the small town and beyond. It was a stark reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that even the most vulnerable-looking individuals could harbor dark secrets. The colonel, once hailed as a hero, became an object of sympathy, his ordeal a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting strangers. The town, once a peaceful haven, was left to grapple with the unsettling realization that evil could lurk in the most unexpected places, hiding behind a mask of innocence, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The colonel's life, forever altered, stood as a testament to the enduring impact of that fateful night.